Chapter 8, Connection. The inn's heavy oak doors swung inward, spilling out a swell of warmth, laughter, and the riotous music of a lute. The common room was bursting with life, merchants slamming mugs together, sailors singing off-key shanties, and locals swaying arm in arm to a drunken rhythm. Izzi paused at the threshold, the press of bodies before her almost impenetrable. She was small enough to vanish into a crowd, and so she did, slipping between hips and shoulders, weaving like a shadow, her ears catching snatches of bawdy jokes and the clatter of dice. Her eyes were searching, not for drink or song, but for him. Kaelen. She found him easily, leaning against the railing of the upper floor, broad shoulders half silhouetted in the lantern light, his gaze turned downward as though cataloging every stranger who came and went. He hadn't seen her yet. That suited her just fine. For once, she wanted to approach quietly, without him knowing first. Step by careful step, she crossed the room and climbed the creaking stairs. The laughter below dulled, but the pulse of it still thrummed in her bones. At the landing she lingered, and then softly, "Kaelen." The orc's head turned at once, and his eyes narrowed as they swept over her. His stare was steady, measuring. It lingered on her new shirt, far tighter than her usual garb, and the faint gleam of silk peeking from beneath her leather. The corner of his mouth tugged upward. "Had yourself quite the time?" he rumbled, voice threaded with humor. "Ruined the old one, did you? That good?" The words should have landed lighthearted, but her face betrayed her. The smile she had worn, her armor fractured. Her eyes, bright but hollowed by something deeper, gave her away. Kaelen straightened, his jest fading. "Is?" he asked, the name shaped into a question. She did not answer at first. Instead, she turned away from him, walking to the railing. Her hands gripped the wood as though anchoring herself. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, stripped of its usual playful lilt. "I froze," she admitted, her voice low, eyes fixed on the chaos below, though she wasn't seeing it. Selene appeared. It was like the ground dropped out from under me. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. The panic came crashing down, worse than I've felt in years. She pressed her fingers to the railing as though to steady herself. "I thought I was ready," she went on, voice trembling at the edges. "I thought I could take her on with the same confidence I had back in Avaran. But that wasn't mine, not really. You were there, Kaelen. You anchored me. You gave me that confidence. Alone, it slipped through my fingers. And now I see." She drew a sharp breath, shaking her head. "I'm weaker than I thought I was." Kaelen's presence was suddenly at her side, solid and grounding. He didn't speak immediately. His silence was not dismissive. It was heavy, deliberate. When he finally turned to her, his gaze was softer than she had ever seen. "It's been a long time since I've seen you like this," he spoke softly. "I thought the panic attacks were gone." Her lips parted, but she said nothing. Instead, she looked at him, truly looked, and found no mockery there, no pity, just compassion. "If she comes again," Kaelen said, resting a broad hand gently on her shoulder, "I'll be there. I always will be." For a moment, her composure cracked and her eyes stung. She leaned into him, just slightly, and let his arms circle her in a rare embrace. The strength of it pressed her back into herself, gave her the shape she thought she had lost. "You can stop whenever you want," he told her, voice rumbling against her ear. "But if you keep going, then do it knowing you're not alone. I'll be at your side, always. You're tougher than you think, Iz." Izzi let out a long, trembling breath. Her smile returned, faint but real this time. "I want to push through," she whispered. "I have to. I'll take this from her and make it mine, for me." Kaelen gave her shoulder a final, firm pat before releasing her, nodding once as if the matter were settled. But in his eyes lingered the quiet vow of a man who had no intention of letting her fight her battles alone. Izzi let out a sharp breath, then lifted both hands and gave her cheeks a quick, playful slap, enough to sting faintly and wake herself from the heaviness clinging to her chest. She drew in a steadier breath, straightening her shoulders, forcing some spark back into her voice. "Well," she said with a faint grin, "that's enough brooding for one night. How about you, big guy? Hopefully your day in the city was better than mine." Kaelen studied her for a beat, his dark eyes narrowing just slightly as if weighing the truth in her words. Then, with that crooked half-smile that never quite reached his scarred cheek, he gave a small grunt of amusement. Met an interesting man, he said, his tone even but carrying a flicker of humor. Loud, ridiculous, worth telling you about over breakfast. That's a story in itself. He tipped his chin toward the room below. But right now, take a look at that. Izzi followed his gaze and blinked, surprised she hadn't noticed sooner. Right in the heart of the crowded inn, surrounded by the swell of laughter and clattering mugs, the scribe stood, no longer the quiet, uncertain boy she had first met. His posture was open, his gestures animated, words flowing easily with a small crowd of patrons leaning in to listen. His cheeks were flushed from drink, but his smile was genuine, bright in a way that lit his entire face. He looked alive in a way she had never seen before, like the weight he had carried since VIII had been replaced with something freer. "You did that," Kaelen murmured, his deep voice steady and unshakably certain. "You unshackled him." For a long moment, Izzi didn't answer. She simply leaned against the railing, eyes fixed on the scribe below as though caught in a spell. The crowd around him seemed distant, muffled. What she saw was him, shining in his own small way, and she felt something warm stir beneath the ache that Selene had left in her chest. It wasn't pride exactly, it was relief, gratitude, maybe even hope. Her lips curved almost hesitantly at first, then deepened into something softer, steadier. A smile without artifice, stripped of wit and charm, real, unguarded. She turned her head slightly toward Kaelen, her voice low, touched with fondness she couldn't quite mask. "Well, at least that's one good thing to come out of today." Kaelen didn't reply, just gave a quiet grunt of agreement and folded his arms, watching both her and the scribe with a kind of silent satisfaction. For Izzi, the noise of the inn suddenly didn't feel so heavy. For the first time since leaving that room upstairs, the hollowness loosened its grip, replaced by a fragile, genuine warmth that lingered even as she turned her gaze back to the crowd below. Kaelen's eyes fell back onto Izzi. He was worried for her more than he cared to admit. The light of late morning spilled across the wooden floorboards of the rented room, warming the air with the smell of bread baking in ovens below and the faint tang of stale ale. Kaelen was already awake, seated by the window, arms folded across his chest, his dark eyes fixed lazily on the street outside. Izzi stretched out on her bed, hair tousled but her expression calm, the closest thing to well-rested she had looked in days. On the floor, however, the picture was less graceful. Renlyn lay sprawled half-naked across a pile of blankets, one leg bent at an odd angle, his hair in wild tangles across his face. His mouth opened in a sharp gasp, and suddenly he lurched upright with a strangled sound, eyes wide. A heartbeat later, he scrambled to the window and shoved it open, gagging and retching violently into the alley below. Izzi sat up slowly, arms crossed over her knees, watching him with a feline smirk curling across her lips. "And here I thought Kaelen and I were the ones who needed watching," she drawled. "Turns out we had to babysit you last night. You should have seen yourself smiling, singing, nearly fell face first into a plate of cheese." Renlyn groaned, shoulders tight, one hand braced against the sill as he coughed and spat into the street. His cheeks flushed crimson, though whether from embarrassment or the lingering aftershock of too much wine, it was impossible to tell. Kaelen pushed himself up from the chair, the faintest shadow of amusement tugging at his mouth. But more than that, he watched Izzi. Watched the way her teasing words came with steady ease, the sparkle behind them just a little closer to the woman he knew. The elf was putting herself back together, shard by shard. He said nothing of it, but the relief showed in his eyes. "Come on," Kaelen rumbled, brushing his palms down his tunic. "We should get some food in you before you waste away completely, scribe. Or maybe you'll manage to keep it down this time." He cast a glance at the sunlight streaming through the window. "Breakfast, lunch, at this hour. Either way, it's time we talk. See if anyone uncovered anything useful. My day was a waste." He glanced at Izzi, who nodded once in agreement. Renlyn finally turned from the window, pale and sheepish, tugging on the discarded shirt by his bedroll. He said nothing at first, only followed their movements as Kaelen headed for the door. Izzi lingered a moment, adjusting the hem of her new blouse, her expression unreadable. It was Renlyn who broke the silence, voice quiet but earnest. His eyes found her, flicking briefly to the tight fit of the fabric, to the way the light softened her outline. "You look nice. New clothes?" he said, the words fumbling out before he could stop them. For the briefest heartbeat, Izzi froze, a flicker of something unguarded crossing her features. Then her lips curled into the smallest smile, light, fleeting, but there all the same. "Well," she said softly, brushing her hair back over her shoulder, "at least one of us has an eye for fashion." With that, she strode toward the door, leaving Renlyn to tug on his boots in a flurry. Kaelen gave him a flat look that needed no words, then followed Izzi out. Together, the three made their way down the narrow stairwell, the noise and smell of roasting meats rising to meet them as they stepped toward the common room. It was late morning, and the three of them sat together at a long wooden table in the inn's dining hall. The air smelled of roasted onions, bread just pulled from the hearth, and the faint tang of stale ale from the night before. A fire cracked lazily in the hearth, filling the corners of the hall with a low warmth. Izzi leaned back against her chair, arms crossed and expression still a touch weary but more composed than the night before. Kaelen sat beside her, broad shoulders squared, his mug of watered wine untouched. Across from them, Renlyn had straightened his tunic, hair still mussed from sleep, but his eyes clear and bright with the glow of someone who had a secret worth telling. Kaelen broke the silence first, voice low and even. "My day was wasted. Streets full of noise, faces full of suspicion. No answers." Izzi tilted her head, offering a dry half-smile. "Mine wasn't much better, just shadows and dead ends." Her fingers drummed lightly against the tabletop before she glanced at the scribe. "Hopefully you've got more for us, otherwise we'll be eating and drinking ourselves into uselessness." Renlyn's mouth curved into a confident, almost boyish grin. He leaned forward, lowering his voice a touch as though speaking of treasure in a den of thieves. From his satchel, he produced a worn book bound in blue leather, the edges frayed from time and many hands. The gilded letters across the spine caught the light. "Moon on the Water" by Dareth Malcor. "This," he said, sliding it onto the table before them with a deliberate reverence, "is no ordinary novel. Dareth was a chronicler in disguise, a man who dressed truth in fiction. I found his name in the temple archives, buried among ledgers of offerings and forgotten records. At first it meant nothing, until I opened his works." Izzi leaned forward, violet gray eyes narrowing as though the book might reveal its secrets if she stared hard enough. "And?" Renlyn's smile deepened, confidence settling over him like a cloak. He opened the book, the parchment whispering with age. Fingers traced passages, words speaking of rivers, tides, and reflections of moons that were more than just scenery. He read aloud a line, voice steady. "Beneath the temple where the waters run silver, the moon carves its memory upon the stone. When sky and stream kiss, the gate is revealed." Kaelen's brow furrowed, his gaze sharp as he absorbed the words. "That's not poetry, that's instruction." Izzi exhaled softly, her charm dropping into a rare seriousness. So he was hiding truths in his novels, and that line, "where the waters run silver," that's the channels beneath the temple. I saw them carved at the base when we arrived. Renlyn nodded, warmth in his eyes at their attention. "Exactly. I believe this is one piece of many. The artifact isn't whole. It's scattered, hidden in fragments across places like this. But here we may find the first." Kaelen glanced toward Izzi, then back at the scribe. "When?" Renlyn closed the book gently, almost ceremonially. "On the full moon, tonight. The words are clear. The reflection of the sky upon the water reveals the gate. We'll need to be ready. When moonlight touches those channels beneath the temple, the path will open." Izzi leaned back again, exhaling through her nose. A slow grin tugged at her lips, genuine this time. "At least one of us made the day worth it. Not bad, scribe." Renlyn's cheeks flushed faintly, though his grin held firm. Kaelen grunted in agreement, though his eyes softened briefly toward Izzi, noting the way her earlier weariness seemed to lift just a little. "Then it's settled. We wait until nightfall, till then we prepare." The fire in the inn's hearth had burned down to coals, casting a soft orange glow against the wooden walls. Plates clattered, mugs were raised, and the hum of midday voices wrapped the hall in warmth. The book Dareth had written lay between them on the table, but Izzi leaned back in her chair, violet gray eyes narrowing at Kaelen with a sly glint. "Hey," she said, tilting her head. "You owe me a story. Last night you said you met someone. Who? A lover, perhaps?" Kaelen snorted, his broad shoulders shaking with amusement. "Hardly, unless you'd call a pack of thugs and their swollen leader lovers. I crossed paths with them in the alleys, 5, maybe 6 of them. One looked like he'd been hewn from stone, ugly enough to frighten the rats. But before blades were drawn, another figure appeared, hoary and hale. He spoke the name with a mix of respect and irritation. This guy, Charismatic to a fault, loud enough to wake the whole city. But gods, he moves like a storm. His speed, his footwork. It's as if the fight itself bends around him. We fought side by side and he cut through them as though they were nothing. Renlyn's eyes darted to Kaelen. What did he look like? Kaelen leaned back, rubbing his chin as if piecing together the memory. He had hair like copper fire, messy, tied back, but it never stayed put. Clothes rough from the road, a dark coat with sea green trim, a sash to match. Always smiling, like he knew something you didn't. Loud as a tavern bell, quick with his words, quicker with his blade. The kind of man who fills a room without trying. The scribe's eyes widened. Did he carry a saber? Kaelen gave a small nod. Aye. Renlyn slapped the table, nearly spilling the last of the wine. That's him. I remember now. He was here last night, louder than the whole crowd put together. He pulled me into drinking songs until my throat was raw, called me his ink-fingered partner and swore we'd make a fine pair of mercenaries. Gods, I thought he'd topple the inn with his laughter. You don't say. Kaelen muttered, shaking his head. Izzi leaned back again, her expression unreadable save for the faint arch of a brow. Sounds loud. Sounds obnoxious. Kaelen smirked and tilted his head toward her. Aye, just your type. Izzi crossed her arms, her expression caught somewhere between amusement and annoyance. So let me get this straight. Both of you had your little adventures with this Horian, and I'm the only one who didn't? You got to fight beside him, Kaelen, and you, she pointed at the scribe, got drunk and sang half the night with him. Meanwhile, I spent my day well. I'd say I'm owed. Renlyn, cheeks still pink from embarrassment, grinned sheepishly. He did leave quite the impression. Kaelen chuckled under his breath, then leaned forward, elbows braced on the table. His brow furrowed as a thought tugged at him. Come to think of it, he mentioned a place to me. A coastal village, blue beaches, fishing boats strung with lanterns. Said his name could open doors there if I ever needed a warm bed and a pitcher of ale. For a moment the three of them sat together, the weight of the morning's plans easing under the mention of this loud mercenary who had tangled, in his own way, with each of them. The inn's noise swelled around their table, laughter and song spilling like tides, and it almost felt like Horian was still there among them. Renlyn leaned forward, curiosity plain on his face. So what's this place called then? Kaelen rested his forearms on the table, his voice even. Cerulea's Rest, that's what he said. Some coastal village to the south, blue beaches, endless taverns, that sort of talk. Izzi's ears perked instantly. She leaned back with a mischievous grin, eyes glinting. The bluest waters you'll ever see, white sands, a tavern where the wine runs like rivers, men and women, beautiful. She recited the words like a song, her tone lilting, every phrase deliberately over-enunciated. Kaelen blinked at her, genuinely surprised. That's exactly what he said. Izzi tilted her head, still grinning, though a softer light lingered in her eyes. Then we simply have to go, don't you think? Renlyn laughed under his breath, shaking his head as though he couldn't believe either of them. Kaelen muttered, almost reluctant. You sound just like him when you say it. Maybe he and I have more in common than you think, she teased, though her smile carried no malice, only that quicksilver charm she wore so well. Renlyn closed the book and slid it toward the center of the table, his fingers lingering on the worn leather before letting it go. Keep looking through it, he said, voice steady but with a flicker of energy beneath. There's more in Dareth's works, I know it. Too many threads circling the same mysteries. I want to see if the other volumes carry answers. Kaelen leaned back, folding his arms. Or perhaps, he said with a sly grin, you just want another reason to step foot in that library. Renlyn bristled, shifting his satchel strap higher over his shoulder. Well, it's useful to have someone there who knows the collection. Izzi's eyes followed him carefully, her lips curved in the shape of a smile, but there was a softness behind it, a weight. She must have been very helpful, she teased gently, though her tone lacked its usual playful sting. For a heartbeat, her gaze slipped away, down toward the table, before she looked back up with a lightness she forced into place. Renlyn flushed red, fumbling with his cloak. I'll meet you both before nightfall. Guard the book well. Kaelen smirked, watching the boy march toward the door. But Izzi's expression lingered, caught between warmth and a faint sadness as the scribe disappeared into the noise of the inn. She breathed out slowly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Good for him, she murmured under her breath, so low Kaelen almost didn't hear. Then she lifted her chin, smiled that practiced smile of hers, and waved the book lightly. "Let's see what secrets you're hiding, Dareth." Renlyn tugged nervously at the collar of his simple linen tunic as he stepped into the quiet hall. The library smelled faintly of vellum and dried ink, the dust of centuries rising in motes through the shafts of sunlight. His tunic, cream that had seen better days, wrinkled at the sleeves where he'd rolled them halfway up his forearms. His trousers were plain, a muted gray, patched at the knee. He wished, not for the first time, that he looked less like a wanderer and more like someone with command of himself. His boots scuffed against the polished stone, each step sounding too loud, as though the very floor mocked his nerves. And then he saw her. Liora was seated in a tall-backed chair near one of the side alcoves where the window light gilded the edges of her figure. She wore a dress of deep green, the kind dyed carefully but fading now at the hems from years of wear. A modest cut, high at the collar, but her sleeves were rolled to the elbow as though she had claimed a space of comfort amid the formal quiet. Her long dark hair had been braided loosely over one shoulder, stray strands curling down to frame her face. The simple brown leather belt at her waist tugged the dress into neatness, though the way she sat, half-crossed in her chair, book balanced on her knees, spoke more of habit than display. She looked up only when his shadow stretched across her page. Her eyes widened first, then softened, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Renlyn opened his mouth, closed it again, then finally blurted the truth. I couldn't wait to come back." His words tumbled out unpolished, louder than intended, echoing faintly in the high rafters. His ears flushed hot, and he lowered his gaze, fumbling with the strap of his satchel. Liora blinked, startled by his honesty, and then, almost shyly, tilted her head. "I thought you might," she admitted after a pause, her voice hushed, a melody caught in her throat. Her fingers smoothed across the page as though to ground herself. "I was here reading, but if I'm being honest, I was waiting. Until you came." Renlyn's chest tightened. The space between them was heavy with unspoken things, the words caught in their throats. He shifted, drawing the empty chair beside her closer with a creak that felt like a declaration. She smiled faintly, though her hand tugged at her braid, as though to distract from the flush in her cheeks. Neither quite knew how to bridge the gap, but both leaned inward, just slightly, as if the silence itself was pulling them closer. Renlyn hesitated, shifting his weight from foot to foot before he finally asked, "And how was your night?" His voice carried the same clumsy sincerity as before, the words tumbling out before he had a chance to polish them. Liora closed the book resting in her lap, fingers lingering on its spine. "Quiet," she said softly, her gaze flicking past him toward the shelves. "I stayed here after you left. Put away the books we read, one by one. It felt like tucking them into bed." A small, self-conscious smile tugged at her lips. "Then I dreamt. Vividly. Stories and places I've never seen, all tangled together." Her admission lingered between them, fragile but warm, like candlelight on the verge of flickering out. Renlyn found himself smiling despite the hammering of his heart. I suppose there are worse dreams to have." "Suppose so," she murmured, and after a moment rose from her chair. She didn't move far, just drifted toward the shelves with him trailing at her shoulder, as if the choice of their next book could steady the nervous current winding between them. They scanned rows of spines in companionable silence until Leora's hand lifted, plucking a worn leather volume of Dareth's lesser-known work. "This one?" she asked, her tone quiet but certain. Renlyn nodded too quickly, eager to agree, though he hadn't even glimpsed the title. Together they carried the book back to the alcove, where the tall-backed chair now seemed too small for two. Liora sat first, sliding toward the corner, and after a hesitant breath, Renlyn lowered himself beside her. Their shoulders brushed, just barely, and he stiffened, though she leaned as though it were the most natural thing in the world. As they opened the book between them, her braids slipped forward, strands of hair tickling against his cheek. He froze, heat rising up his neck while she tilted her head toward the page, unaware, or perhaps pretending not to notice, the way her hair brushed his skin. The alcove seemed smaller than before, softer, wrapped in the scent of old parchment and the faint sweetness of her presence. Renlyn turned a page carefully, fingers brushing the yellowed corner, and began to read aloud. His voice was low at first, unsteady, as though each syllable might trip him. Yet the words soon filled the alcove, weaving Dareth's ornate phrasing into something gentler. Liora shifted closer, her shoulder pressing more firmly to his. Her eyes lingered not on the book, but on him. "I enjoy hearing your voice," she said simply, her tone neither coy nor bold, just honest. The comment struck him harder than any compliment he had ever received. His breath caught, then smoothed, and the next passage rolled from his lips with more confidence, each phrase steadier, each pause more deliberate. The words no longer stumbled, they belonged to him. As the story unfolded, their reading gave way to small exchanges. Liora asked where he first discovered Dareth's work, what drew him to old books rather than new tales sung in taverns. He confessed, a bit embarrassed, that he'd always felt safer in libraries than among people, that the written word had never judged him the way eyes often did. She listened with rapt attention, her ocean blue eyes gleaming in the dim alcove light. When she finally spoke, it was softer still. "I understand more than you think." Renlyn looked up, surprised, and in that moment her hand, delicate yet sure, settled on his leg. A light squeeze, reassuring and grounding. His heart lurched, but in his nervousness he didn't truly register the gesture, lost instead in the storm of her gaze. Her head tilted, hair brushing his cheek again, and though she said nothing more, the silence was weighted with something deeper than words. Renlyn shifted the book slightly aside, his thumbs still holding their place, though the words upon the page no longer mattered. He tilted his head just enough to glance at Liora. "You've asked me everything," he said, his voice quieter now, more careful. "But what about you?" Her lips curved faintly, as though she had been waiting for him to ask. "Me?" she repeated, almost teasing. She turned her gaze back to the shelves as though seeking the right words among them. "I've always been here, among the dust and ink. My family is far away. The books, they became my company, my world. I suppose I started reading them so I wouldn't feel so alone." Renlyn leaned in, listening intently, not daring to interrupt. He wanted to hear every crack of honesty in her voice. "And yet," she continued softly, her eyes flicking back to him, "today didn't feel lonely." That admission hung between them, warmer than any fire. She studied him openly now, her blue eyes unflinching, lingering on his face as though committing every detail to memory. Slowly, deliberately, she shifted closer, until her shoulder pressed more firmly against his arm, her breath almost brushing his cheek. Renlyn's pulse thundered. His courage, so frail at first, seemed to flare with every heartbeat. He closed the remaining space, only a breath, and their lips met, hesitant at first, then sure, carrying with it all the awkward sweetness of two people who had lingered too long in silence and finally dared to break it. They parted just slightly, breath mingling in the quiet alcove. Renlyn's eyes darted down, flustered, words tumbling out before he could stop them. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have..." "Don't," Liora whispered, her voice soft but steady. "Don't be sorry." Before he could protest again, she leaned back in, lips finding his with more certainty this time. Her hands rose to cradle his cheeks, warm and deliberate, guiding him so he couldn't retreat even if he wanted to. Renlyn froze, his hands stiff at his sides, caught between shyness and wonder. He felt the press of her mouth, the faint tremble of her breath, the closeness of her body. And then she shifted, her movements gentle, almost weightless, as she slid into his lap, straddling him with graceful ease. His eyes widened, half open, drinking in the sight of her face so near, lashes fluttering, her cheeks flushed pink, her lips moving against his with slow, unhurried care. She kissed him gently, again and again, each one lingering longer, her forehead brushing his as if to keep him anchored. He sat perfectly still, almost afraid to break the spell, his gaze flicking over her features, the soft curve of her closed eyes, the faint crease of concentration in her brow, the delicate strands of hair falling around her cheeks. It was too much, too unreal, and yet he couldn't look away. Liora pulled back just enough to study his frozen hands at his sides. A soft, almost playful smile touched her lips before she slipped one of her hands from his cheek and reached down. Her fingers found his, warm, tense, uncertain, and she wove them together, coaxing him. Renlyn blinked, startled as she guided his hand, not forcing but persuading, until it came to rest at her hip. The curve beneath his palm was unfamiliar and overwhelming, yet she pressed him there firmly, as if telling him this was where he was meant to be. She did the same with his other hand, placing it on her opposite hip, leaving him to hold her as she lingered above him. Her lips returned to his, soft but insistent, and this time he felt her move. Her hips shifted slowly, a subtle motion that caught him off guard, pressing forward with a deliberate rhythm, rolling faintly against him as she kissed him. His pulse spiked, the air caught in his chest. Every movement was unhurried, deliberate, but it sent fire crawling up his spine. He noticed it now, every shift of her body, every gentle push and pull as her mouth lingered on his. He gripped her hips without meaning to, tightening under the quiet urging of her touch, his own restraint fighting the rush of heat that spread through him. Liora broke from his lips just long enough to rest her forehead against his, her breath uneven, her eyes half-lidded yet glittering with a knowing light. "Better," she whispered, as though she'd just taught him a lesson. Then she kissed him again, and the world narrowed to her weight in his lap and the slow, maddening sway of her hips. Renlyn was still flustered, every breath shaky, but he made a choice, to stop resisting and let her guide him. Liora was steady where he faltered, bold where he hesitated, and in that moment he realized how lost he would be without her leading him forward. "You," she whispered, almost shy, yet with a sweetness that made his heart stumble. The words were simple, but they left him undone. Her hands left his cheeks, gliding down the curve of his neck and resting over his chest. Each touch sent shivers through him, her fingers lingering as though memorizing the shape of him. He could hear her breath now, quick, uneven, growing heavier as her lips hovered close to his again. For all her forwardness, she was trembling too, caught in the same unsteady current that carried them both. And though the scribe could hardly move, hardly think, he leaned into it, surrendering to her rhythm, to the closeness neither of them could pull away from. The scribe's grip on her hips tightened, his breath uneven, as if he might lose himself without her steadying weight. Liora leaned in closer, guiding the moment with a quiet confidence, her movements deliberate and slow. He stared into her blue eyes, wide with wonder, unable to look away even as his chest rose and fell with quickened breaths. Her hand brushed lower, loosening the buckle at his waist with a practiced ease, and he felt his body jolt upward in surprise, his fingers fumbling nervously at the hem of her dress. She only smiled faintly, pressing closer, guiding him as though reminding him that this was hers to lead. Their gazes locked, unyielding, unblinking as she began to move again, a rhythm, small and intimate, that carried them both into the same breath. His calm, heavy, ragged, hers softer but just as urgent. A sound slipped from her lips, quiet but sharp, matched by the faintest echo from his throat. The alcove around them vanished into shadows and warmth. Her hands traced a path down from his cheek, along his neck, pausing over the frantic beat of his heart before pressing to his chest. Every touch anchored him, every motion pulled him further into her pace. Their breaths grew heavier still, and the silence filled with the fragile music of two voices straining against restraint, trembling on the edge of something deeper. Renlyn's hands, still trembling where they rested at her hips, began at last to move with her. At first it was hesitant, a subtle shift of his body beneath hers, unsure if he even had the right to answer her rhythm. But when he felt her breath stutter and saw the way her lashes fluttered against flushed cheeks, he dared a little more. His hips rose gently to meet hers, guided not by confidence but by instinct, by the simple need to match her. The smallest sound escaped her, a breath that was not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh, as if she approved without words. She pressed closer, continuing her slow, deliberate sway, encouraging him to follow. Renlyn's heart raced at the unspoken permission, and soon his movements grew more sure, falling into step with hers until their bodies were moving together in a fragile, unbroken rhythm. Their breaths mingled in the narrow space between them, shallow and quick, each one caught on the other's lips. The warmth of her hair brushed his cheek, her scent filling his head, and still their eyes held, as if to look away would shatter the spell. Every motion built upon the last, measured, tender, unhurried, and with each passing heartbeat, the silence around them broke further with quiet, involuntary sounds that neither of them tried to suppress. Her hands lingered against his chest, feeling the rise and fall of his breath as it deepened, grew rougher, more uneven. His own grip at her waist tightened, not to control, but to hold on, as though afraid she might slip away if he didn't. And still she guided him, her gentle weight and coaxing movements drawing him deeper into the moment, until his own body could no longer resist answering her in kind. Liora's movements began to slow, her lips parting into the faintest smile, soft, trembling, almost shy despite everything. Renlyn felt it, the subtle change in her, and something stirred inside him. With a hesitant strength, he shifted beneath her, carefully rolling so that their places reversed. She let him guide her down onto the cushions, her hands lingering against his shoulders as if testing this new balance. For a heartbeat, he hovered there, looking into her eyes, his breath ragged, searching for any sign of hesitation. But all he found was her gaze, open and yielding, filled with the same need that burned through his own chest. Encouraged, he pressed forward once more, this time with him leading, his motions steady, deliberate, and unshaken by the timidness that had ruled him before. Her breath hitched with each movement, a quiet sound breaking from her throat, answered by the deeper rhythm of his own. The silence of the alcove filled with the soft cadence of their breathing, the faintest echoes of quiet moans slipping free as their bodies found perfect unison again. She clung to him now, not to guide, but to hold, as if she needed him close, as if letting go would break her in two. Time blurred, the rhythm grew more urgent, the intensity building with every shared motion, every stolen breath. Neither spoke, but the truth was written in their eyes, the hunger, the surrender, the fragile wonder of finding this closeness after so much hesitation. At last the wave crested between them, emotion breaking open into a shared release neither could have held back if they tried. Their voices met in the smallest of sounds, stifled but unmistakable, trembling in the air as their bodies gave in together. Liora clung to him, her lips brushing his ear as she let out one final, breathless moan, the sound quivering against his skin. Renlyn answered in kind, his voice rough and low in her own ear, their breaths tangling in a fevered exchange that seemed to bind them closer than any words could. Spent, he collapsed forward, careful but unable to keep from resting his full weight against her. Their foreheads touched, both slick with sweat, their noses brushing as their chests rose and fell in uneven rhythm. Liora's eyes fluttered open just enough to catch his, and for a long moment, they simply stayed there, locked together, trembling, but strangely at peace in the aftermath. They didn't part immediately. Still bound together, breaths ragged, Renlyn felt her nails digging into his back as though she couldn't bear to let him go. His chest pressed against hers with each rise and fall of his breath, their heartbeats echoing in rhythm, thunder in the quiet alcove. He started, but his voice caught, cracking in his throat. He swallowed hard, forehead pressed to hers. I don't have words, Liora. She smiled faintly, her lips brushing his as she whispered, You don't need them. Her arms tightened around him, pulling him closer, her body clinging like she feared he might fade if she loosened her hold. Renlyn's hand, still trembling, slid along her side and settled at her waist, grounding himself in her warmth. He couldn't deny how his body still throbbed against her, caught in the aftershocks, but it was her closeness that undid him most. I feel like I'm still lost, he confessed softly. But with you, it's less. Her eyes opened slowly, sapphire hues glowing in the dim light, locking onto his with fierce tenderness. You're not lost, she murmured, brushing her nose against his cheek. I'll hold you until you believe it. He almost broke at that, his eyes stinging, his body pressed deeper into hers as though her words themselves anchored him. For a moment, there was no artifact, no temple, no looming shadows, only her and the comfort she gave without question. They stayed together in silence, the hush of the library embracing them like a living thing. Dusty motes drifted through the air where the lamps flickered, painting faint halos around the shelves. Renlyn lay with her in the alcove, her head resting lightly against his shoulder, her hair spilling in warm strands across his chest. He could feel her breathing, steady and soft, matching the rise and fall of his own. It was as though the world beyond that corner had ceased to exist, time bending, slowing, until only the two of them remained. Every shift, every brush of her sleeve against his arm spoke volumes more than words. Her hand, still lightly tangled with his, felt impossibly small yet firm, as if she meant to hold him in place. He realized with a quiet ache that he wanted nothing more than to stay like this forever, wrapped in the faint perfume of old parchment and her presence. But eventually, the press of duty returned. The world outside, and Kaelen and Izzi waiting for him, tugged against the moment like a cruel hand. He lingered as long as he could, tracing the line of her hair with his gaze before kissing her temple gently. I have to go, he whispered, his voice thick with reluctance. His arms did not loosen at once. Instead, they clung to her for one last heartbeat. But I'll be back soon. Liora's eyes opened slowly, their blue striking even in the dim alcove light. A smile curved at her lips, soft, playful, but trembling with something deeper. "Then, maybe," she said with an edge of shyness, "we can do some more. Reading together." The emphasis made his face heat, his lips breaking into a helpless, boyish grin. He squeezed her hand tighter, almost as if sealing a vow. "Next time, I'll take you out somewhere first. I promise." Her smile deepened, her fingers tightening around his as though she wanted to keep him there, to draw him back every time he tried to leave. When at last he rose and slipped away from the alcove, she leaned against the wall, watching him until the last glimpse of his figure disappeared between the crooked shelves. Only then did she exhale, her hand drifting up to her lips as if to hold the memory of his kiss in place. Her heart still beat wildly in her chest, not from nerves anymore, but from the budding certainty that he would keep that promise. The temple rose before them in the night, its broken stone archways and waterlogged foundations whispering with the sound of the tide. The moon hung low, its reflection beginning to glide toward the southern edge of the temple's dock, like a silver arrow finding its mark. Renlyn arrived with a brisk stride, a faint glow clinging to him that not even the damp air could dim. His clothes were a little more rumpled than before, but his step was light, his eyes bright with a fire Izzi hadn't seen in him before. She tilted her head, watching, lips quirking in a sly grin. Without saying a word, she nudged Kaelen in the ribs. He turned, puzzled, and she only shook her head, laughing under her breath. Whatever had lit the scribe up, she wasn't about to ruin it with questions. They gathered just outside the temple's yawning entry, moonlight splintering across the surface of the water below. Kaelen's expression sobered. "South side," he said, eyes fixed on the reflection. "That's where it'll align. That's where we need to be when it touches the dock." Renlyn adjusted the strap of his satchel, his usual nerves smoothed over by that unplaceable energy still coursing through him. "Do you think Selene will show?" he asked, glancing between them. Izzi's smile faded, her tone cutting sharper than expected. "No, she doesn't know about the book, about the lead. At least, not yet." Her gaze drifted toward the temple's broken columns, shadows yawning deeper than they had a right to. "But that doesn't mean we should let our guard down. She has a way of slipping in when you least expect it. So, eyes open, blades ready." Kaelen's hand found the hilt of his sword, fingers tightening until his knuckles whitened. Izzi slid her twin daggers free, the familiar weight calming her heart in its quickened pace. Then she turned, her violet-gray eyes landing squarely on Renlyn. She took her rapier from her belt, the steel whispering as it cleared its sheath, and held it out to him. "You need to keep yourself safe too," she said softly, pressing the hilt into his hands. Her tone left no room for argument. It was not a request but an order wrapped in care. Renlyn stared at the weapon as though it were more than steel, as though she'd just handed him a piece of herself. He nodded, swallowing the sudden tightness in his throat. The moonlight shimmered across the blade, casting its reflection on his face as he closed his fingers around the grip. As Izzi released the rapier into Renlyn's grip, his eyes lingered on her hand. For the first time, he noticed the bandages, tight, white wrappings traced with faint stains where the skin beneath had bled through. His brow furrowed, but before he could ask, Izzi caught the direction of his gaze. She lifted her hand casually, wiggling her fingers as though it were nothing more than a bruise. Her smile bloomed, playful, soft, the same charm she always wore when she wanted to divert attention. "Just a few nicks from the other day," she said lightly, her voice lilting with practiced ease. "Not to worry." Her tone was teasing, almost sing-song, but Kaelen felt a cold prickle run along his spine. He watched her eyes as she said it, bright, mischievous, but hiding something just beneath, something raw. His hand shifted closer to the hilt of his sword, not because of danger around them, but because of the storm he sensed inside her. The scribe, clutching the rapier, looked from one to the other, sensing an undercurrent he didn't fully understand. Izzi just held his gaze a moment longer, smile unwavering, as though daring him not to believe her. Kaelen exhaled slowly, the unease settling deep in his chest. For a moment, the three of them stood in silence at the temple's mouth, steel, stone, and shadow, breath and heartbeat syncing with the tide's slow rhythm. Then, without another word, they stepped forward together, crossing into the ruin where destiny, and whatever waited beneath, was already stirring.
Thank you for listening. Please like, comment, and subscribe. More chapters are on the way.